And here's how the interesting thing started. One of the big questions is, all these ground troops have been sent, 82nd Airborne, the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, the 11th, some special forces, apparently another 10,000 has been deployed or alerted on top of that. So a lot of combat power. What about boots on the ground? Here's what he said.
As far as President Trump and boots on the ground, I don't understand why the base, which they have already, they understand, wouldn't have faith in his ability to execute on this. Look at his track record of pursuing peace through strength, America first outcomes. What he's simply saying, and it's exactly true, and I've said from this podium too, we're not going to foreclose any option. You can't fight and win a war if you tell your adversary what you are willing to do or what you are not willing to do, to include boots on the ground. Our adversary right now thinks there are 15 different ways we could come at them with boots on the ground. And guess what? There are. Not do. But if anybody has internalized the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan as the first one, President Trump, to call them out for what they are, he's not going to.
Okay, a lot to unpack there. We'll start with that last one first. There was a number of statements in there I think were designed to try to solve, I don't know if placate is the right word, but to make the base feel better by saying words that they like to hear. But I just wonder, to what extent are those words happening when, as he says, look at the ground truth, look at the actual result here. And we'll start with the last one there. This is not Iraq. This is not a forever war, because President Trump understands that.
Well, let's consider the simple fact that the commercial traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has fallen by 95 to 97%. Commercial traffic on the pre-war scale will not resume anytime soon. An estimated 15 million barrels of oil a day have been taken offline. Shortages in Asia have already driven Singapore jet fuel to $231 per barrel. And while this war persists, insurance brokers will not underwrite shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. So let's just stop at that point and consider that it's not just petroleum products. It's broader than that. In other words, when it comes to growing food, feedstocks, fertilizer, these things are not available. And this is starting to have a profound impact around the globe. Even if the war stopped tomorrow morning, it would take at least, I suspect, 6 months to a year to try and recover from the damage that we've inflicted thus far. And what we're preparing to do now, and I think this is pretty clear from his statement, is to do again what we did before, only more so. In other words, the intensity and the numbers of missiles and bombs and so forth that are going to be hurled at Iran will be greater. And I guess there's the expectation that if you do this again with greater gusto, that somehow or another that's going to shut down Iran. I don't think it will. And to this, we add ground forces. Now, we're talking about roughly 20,000 light infantry from the Army and the Marines. There are all sorts of things they can do with those. But I'm not sure that that is going to produce a fundamental change in the strategic conditions that we've developed. So, I'm trying to figure out, all right, Mr. Secretary, you're telling us you're going to make things worse. You're going to bomb more intensively. And the assumption is that this will work. And where's the evidence that it will work? Well, look at the numbers of missiles and drones that are being launched. They're not being launched in the same volume as they were before. Well, I can say that our airstrikes are not being launched in the same volume as they were a few weeks ago. Does that mean we've lost? Does it mean that we're incapable? Of course not. And every time someone talks about, well, the Iranians are about through, they've run out of missiles and so forth, we see another wave of tactical ballistical or theater ballistic missile attacks or intermediate range ballistic missile attacks on the Saudi Peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, the former Gulf Emirates, or we see that in Israel. I'm trying to find evidence for what he's insisting has happened. And the only evidence I can find is that, we did a lot of damage. It hasn't worked.
And then the question is, what are you going to do to make it work, and what are you going to do differently? And one of the other things she said in that opening soundbite there was that, listen, we're in the peace through strength and America first. I mean, those are obviously buzzwords that the base certainly likes to hear. But At what point does the base? So obviously, the independents and the left is never believed any of it anyway. But what extent does the base is going to keep saying, okay, America first, because you're going in on the ground here? I don't see where that's America first. Are these messages going to stop resonating, or do you think they'll keep going on for a long time?
Two things. First, the economic impact of this war is driving us into recession. And President Trump comes on every day or every other day and makes statements that he hopes will calm markets. He's trying to manipulate the marketplace to persuade people things aren't as bad as you think they are. This war isn't going to last as long as everyone says. Now, how much longer can he do this? Can he do it for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks? It all depends upon whether or not you think you're going to get a sudden collapse of Iran and a sudden willingness to surrender Iran to Israel, which is actually what we're fighting for. Remember, this is a war, as Hegseth says, for Israel against Iran. So I don't see that happening. So that's the first part. The second business is, again, what's the economic impact globally? And most Americans don't know what it is. It's profound. It's back to fuel, food, feedstock, and fertilizer. We're looking at famines breaking out over the next 6 to 12 months because in Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, you can't grow food without fertilizer. Your green revolution is being effectively reversed. And then finally, the issue for most Americans, sadly, is if you only lose a few people on any given day, very few people pay attention. In other words, 10, 15, 20 people killed or wounded. That's unfortunate, but Americans aren't going to be sort of distracted from the television, from the game on Monday night, or from buying a six-pack at 7-Eleven. On the other hand, if we were to lose 400, 500, 600 men within the space of 24 hours, that would probably alert everybody that, my God, we're in a real war. And you see, the game in Washington is to convince everybody it's not a real war. It's only a war for the Iranians. And that's not true. It is a war that is regional and has the potential to go global. But Americans aren't paying attention because, frankly, the enemy has not killed large numbers of us, thank God. But if that happens, and I think that's a distinct possibility, depending upon what we do with these ground forces, that could change.
And in fact, speaking of those ground forces, whatever they may do, Hegseth said there are 15 different ways that we could use these troops, and Iran doesn't know which ones they are. And they're right. They all are options here. But it almost doesn't matter what they are, whether it's Karg Island, whether it's Kashim Island, some of these other smaller ones actually in the Strait. Bandar Abbas, as you have heard it recently, it's been in the news also. And then even some ground operations up in the Kurdistan area on the Iranian side of that border. I mean, it almost doesn't matter what they would be doing. It's hard for me to imagine any ground operation with that number of troops in a country that's 4 times bigger than Iraq. It is expecting some ground troops and has mobilized a lot of their Basij to well over 1 million total troops. Is there any kind of plausible plan that would reap some sort of benefit for the commensurate with the cost we would likely lose in blood?
It seems unlikely to me. It's sort of sending people with jackhammers to the Rock of Gibraltar and say, we want you to remove this rock over the next 24 to 36 hours. So 1,000 jackhammers start working on the Rock of Gibraltar. How's that going to turn out? It's not going to make a dent. The Rock of Gibraltar is not falling. It's not going to move. And that's the way I see this strategically. It's back to the earlier comment. You're using air and naval power to lay siege to a giant continental power, Iran, that is protected by mountain ranges and deserts, has 93 million people. How do you inflict real damage that's going to make any difference? And I think that's part of why you're hearing from Donald Trump and others the possibility that in addition to the oil infrastructure and the power grid, we may also attack desalination plants. And of course, the problem with it is that Iran will respond. If you look at the desalination plants, I think somebody said there are roughly 50 of them, maybe a little bit more, across the Arabian Peninsula, reaching up into Kuwait. If you destroy those, you're going to ensure that millions of people die of thirst. Literally, that's what will happen. You've got a desalination plant outside of Riyadh that is enormous, and without it, the city of Riyadh, the capital city of Saudi Arabia, can't exist, which means that they are already planning on the very high probability that that plant will be destroyed, and they'll have to evacuate more than 1 million people, or they'll face dying of thirst, literally. So that's one problem. The other problem is you've got very few forces. Now, some of those undoubtedly, I guess, are going to be used in the interior of Iran. That's the hope. Others will be used to seize points on the ground or islands in the Persian Gulf that we think are strategically vital to Iran. Well, there's a problem with these assumptions as well. First of all, most of the U.S. Navy in the Indian Ocean is 1,000 miles away from the Persian Gulf. And most of your troops are going to be on ships that have to come in closer to launch V-22s and helicopters carrying Marines into the Gulf area. How do you do it without being discovered? How do you do it without being identified and immediately targeted? Why is the Navy operating 500 to 1,000 miles away from the Persian Gulf? Well, they want to stay alive. They don't want to go under. So that's problem number one. Are you going to take the airborne troops and drop them in from above? In other words, are you going to conduct an airborne assault? You may remember that back in 1991, Schwarzkopf was besieged by the Marine Corps because they wanted him to launch the Marines on an assault against Kuwait City. Later on, the airborne mafia went to Schwarzkopf and said, let us seize Talil Airfield at An Nasiriyah, which you'll remember. And Schwarzkopf said no to both because it would be too many casualties. In fact, he told the Marines, you may lose more Marines in accidents trying to take the city from the sea than you will to enemy fire. It's ridiculous. We're not going to do that. He told the airborne crowd, no, I'm not going to do that. Forget it. You'll get a lot of people injured. What are you going to accomplish? Now, in this setting, you're talking about far more competent and lethal enemy in Iran than what we faced in Iraq. And by lethal, I mean these people have weapon systems that allow them to reach out and touch you from hundreds of miles away. They don't have to park missile launchers on any of the islands in the Persian Gulf. They don't even have to put people out there in very many speedboats. All they have to do is drop an intermediate range ballistic missile on top of a ship that's trying to go through the Strait of Hormuz. Everybody knows that, and that's why the insurance underwriters aren't going to support it. So if all of those things are true, how are you going to get them in? And then secondly, let's assume that we're brilliant and we have magical ways of doing it. Maybe we have stealth aircraft that can't be detected. Once they're in there, how do you sustain them? How do you evacuate your wounded? How do you feed them? How do you provide water? I mean, where are they going to go to get these things? If you're going to try and fly it all in, I would imagine that every conceivable air and missile defense weapon the Iranians have will be focused on preventing that. Then to that, you've got to add all these precision guided weapons, whether they're drones or missiles, that will be used against the forces that you put on the ground. Now, I suppose somebody wants to run around Iran and try to find enriched uranium. Well, good luck with that. Again, you're going to have to fly a long, long way. Remember what Desert One looked like and how far they had to fly from their location in the southern part of Iran to get to Tehran. I don't know what could happen. And again, how do you find the enriched uranium? How do you be absolutely certain? How can you be absolutely certain that you're onto the right thing? I mean, if I were an Iranian and I thought this was even a possibility, I would plant all sorts of strange pieces of enriched uranium and put them where somebody find them and then sit there and wait for you to show up and destroy you. I mean, the whole thing strikes me as being somewhat ludicrous, but I could be wrong. Maybe they've got a special magic way to do this that will avoid pitfalls that I've described. I don't know.
Well, and I'm showing on the map here as you're looking in. I mean, if you went in from Iraq to Isfahan, which is, or Natanz, either one of these things here, you're talking about that's 454 miles if you're coming in from Iraq, and that's the straight line distance in the air. And you see all this has to go over Iranian territory. So every bit of this route here, just to get troops in to any material that may be in these areas here, that certainly the Iranians can read a map, I would imagine. And so there would be anti-aircraft capability all around here that can take out helicopters. I mean, how risky would that part be?
I would regard the risk as unacceptable. And again, this goes back to our experience with Market Garden. You put enough paratroopers or Marines far enough ahead of you and away from that you can't adequately protect them and reach them. What happens? They get killed or they're taken prisoner. So I think all these things have to be taken into account. I hope that is in fact what's happening. See, the problem again is this tendency to underestimate the Iranians. I think we've done that from the beginning. I think it's a serious mistake to do that now.
And you know, I'm going to go back to something you said just a second ago, because that was also addressed at this press conference this morning. Referred to what President Trump said in his ultimatum on March the 30th here. That's yesterday. The key part where he says, "We will conclude our lovely stay in Iran by blowing up and completely obliterating all of their electric generating plants, oil wells, and Carg Island, and possibly all desalination plants." This morning, one of the questions for the general was, basically kind of, isn't that a war crime? Now he's going to answer this. Tell me if you can interpret what he said to regular English.
General, the president wrote yesterday that the U.S. might destroy Iran's electricity generating plants and oil wells. Those are his words before ending this operation. Is there a way to do either of those things without seriously harming civilians?
Thanks for the question. We're always thinking about those considerations and develop options to be able to mitigate those risks pursuant to the normal practices that we do in the military.
What? Mitigate pursuant to, wait, what does that have to do with taking out desalination plants? How did you interpret that?
I think that General Kane was out of retirement and promoted to 4 stars to do the job. He's going to do what he's told. And from his vantage point as an airman, he and the community of airmen in the Air Force, and probably to a lesser extent in the Navy, but nevertheless as airmen, see this as a brilliant opportunity to validate air power's ability to effectively, quote unquote, win wars. I mean, we've been down this road so many times, we can't even begin to, count them all. So my view is that I think he's aware of that, but he's also going to go back to the things that we did during the Second World War and the things we did in Vietnam. We killed 2 million Vietnamese. How many of those were combatants? Did anyone care? I mean, as war goes on, the logic of violence takes over. And if you can't win one way, then you turn to another. The problem for this approach is that if we destroy desalination plants, if we go forward with this plan to utterly eradicate oil infrastructure, then the Iranians have the ability to target and destroy all of the desalination plants in the Persian Gulf region on the Arabian side. And the last time I looked, there were somewhere between 50 and 57 plants. This would mean that millions of people will die of thirst. That's what it means. And that's setting aside, the fact that we're doing enormous damage to the rest of the world in terms of its ability to grow food because of the fertilizer issue and other critical minerals and chemicals that we can't really live without. So, I think he was telling you, fine, we recognize that and we'll do whatever we're supposed to do to win this war.
Yeah, that's kind of how I viewed it too, because he certainly didn't repudiate that. But let me just kind of ask you, we have, especially after World War II, most around the world on all sides said, we need to come up with, updated Geneva Conventions and the law of land warfare and things that everybody's, sort of fight fair. You can fight viciously, but you have to fight within these rules, et cetera. And for a long time, at least, people gave them rhetorical support. But now then, it seems to me that that those are basically just dead letters, if ever they were anything here. And what are some of the things that President Trump mentioned on there are just categorically the violations of the laws of warfare, where you punish a population, even things that have no military utility. Can we safely conclude that no one cares about the law of warfare anymore, and that there are no war crimes?
Remember, Secretary Higgs has said quite recently, this is a war for Israel against Iran. The Israelis regard this as a war for their existence. The Iranians regard this as a war for their existence. since we are supporting Israel and doing effectively whatever Israel wants us to do in this war, we have taken on the Israeli mentality, targeting philosophy, and approach to war. And if you want to know what the Israeli approach to war is, you have to look at Gaza, look at South Lebanon. In fact, I would say that the Israeli approach at this point is to create imitation Gazas all over the region, and that includes Iran. If Iran can be turned into a Gaza or subjected to Gazification, and that's the price of victory, that's acceptable to the Israelis. That's acceptable to their lobby in the United States and to the Zionist billionaires who are pressuring Trump to fight this war. Now, I would hope that we have somebody left in Washington with some degree of character and backbone to stand up and say, look, this is not an existential war for us. And to be blunt, we've already done more than we should have done. And if this is not enough, so be it. But we should cease fire, because the larger global implications are horrifying, as I tried to point out at the beginning.
Now, let me ask you on the morality of war, because you can argue, certainly with a lot of facts, that at the state level, nobody seems to really care about any kind of laws of war. Certainly nobody's going to hold us accountable, either inside or outside of our government. But about the troops, I remember my first combat experience was under you and several others in Desert Storm, and in the preparation for us to go, even from Saudi Arabia, before we launched into fighting the Iraqi divisions, you guys told us, our leaders, that there's the law of war we have to follow. That we can't shoot prisoners, we can't do all this stuff, and we told us we have to do the right thing, and that imbued us with this moral oughtness that we have to fight hard, but we also have to fight fair. I mean, that's what we had going in there. But if you take away that, and even at the top level, there's no concern about doing what's right. I mean, are you concerned that may trickle down into the troops, and then even at the tactical level, they may also loosen up the laws of tactical warfare?
Well, in every war that lasts for longer than a few weeks, you end up dehumanizing your opponent. We demonize the opponent in any case before we go in, and you can listen to President Trump reading from Netanyahu talking points about how terrible Iran is. And unfortunately, lots of people in the United States have ingested this garbage, and they repeat it ad nauseum. So I try to tell people, Iran has changed quite a bit in the last 47 years. It is by no means the same state or the same society that it was 47 years ago. But nobody wants to go there. Instead, you've thoroughly demonized the opponent. When you demonize the opponent, you end up dehumanizing them, particularly when you go into action. When you lose soldiers, and you may or may not remember that we did lose Sergeant Muller, who was in a Bradley and had 5 or 6 other people wounded. But when he was killed, people emotionally, particularly in his troop, were furious. They were angry, and they became immediately interested in payback. In other words, we'll kill all of these people in front of us. And I had to deal with that, in February 26, with officers as well, who did not want to stop killing. They wanted to continue killing when it was perfectly obvious to me, since we couldn't move, we were restricted from moving, that we had no choice but to stop firing and allow whoever was still out there to live. But there were a lot of people who opposed that. And this is human nature. So that means that, first of all, wars should be kept short if you can do so. They should be fought for limited objectives, not unlimited purposes. Right now, we're in a war that should be limited by the objectives, but it's not. It's a war for the destruction of Iran on behalf of the Israeli state and its agents in the United States, period. That's what this is about. The average American doesn't completely grasp that, but more and more Americans are figuring it out. But again, unless you get a lot of Americans killed, no one's going to pay much attention. And so the objective is to, whatever you do, don't take heavy casualties. And remember, this is the myth of air power. It's sort of sex without consequences. Yeah, go in, bomb, nobody can touch us, and we get away free. Well, that hasn't worked that well this time around, and I think it's not going to work well in the future. I think more and more our manned aircraft are going to be vulnerable. But having said all of that, for the moment, we're still believers in this myth. And as long as that is preserved, we're going to continue to do stupid things. And that includes this war, which doesn't need to be fought. Never needed to be fought, certainly not by us under any circumstances.
Agree with you more. And now I want to take a look for a minute at the American fighting man component of this, because too often they're just kind of dismissed almost as like this caricature of this noble steed kind of thing, that, you know, there's this hero and that they all love to die for their country or something like that, instead of individual human beings. Secretary Hegseth this morning tried to address that as well. And I would like your view on this on the backside of this video, because one of the other things that was really driven into us, whether this turned out to be right or not, is subject to debate. But at the time we went into Desert Storm, we were told that the President of the United States, that this is the right thing to do. He had assembled this huge coalition. So many people were with us because we said Saddam Hussein had invaded another country. They were at risk of cutting off oil, which could cause catastrophe for the entire world, not just the region, to our own country. And we had to stop this madman. So we believed in what we were doing. Now then, as you just correctly pointed out, it doesn't take a rocket science to figure out we shouldn't be fighting this war at all. And so in terms of the fighting man, this morning, Secretary Hegseth tried to address, I'm sorry, the volume's a little bit low on this, but listen to how he's trying to justify the mission and to tell the guys what they're doing matters.
Missiles and drones, and know what a world looks like, what the world would look like if Iran had the most dangerous weapons in the world, a nuclear weapon. As President Trump has said time and time again for years, and in this administration, Iran cannot have a nuclear bomb, and they won't. These troops, they want to finish this fight for their kids and their grandkids. This is about history. This is about legacy. Success matters. And because of this president and these Americans, we're closer than ever before to winning.
Yeah, that's enough right there, Gary. We're not close to anywhere to winning it like that. But do you think that's going to resonate from the Secretary of Defense to the troops down there, that you're fighting for your future and they can't get a nuclear weapon or nobody would be safe, when every piece of intelligence from our government said there was no nuclear weapons program? We had obliterated and no effort had been made to revive it. So none of that can be true. How does that affect the guys fighting at the front, especially those who may have to go in on the ground?
Well, there are two sides to this particular coin. First of all, there were lots of us at the time in the immediate aftermath of World War II who were extremely concerned about the Rosenbergs and their Confederates in the FDR administration that saw to it that Stalin ended up with the formula or the secrets to the atomic bomb. And when the atomic bomb was exploded by the Soviets, people were genuinely and justifiably very afraid. And subsequently, you had people try to convince Truman and then later on Eisenhower that the solution was to launch a preemptive nuclear strike on the Soviet Union. And, you know, they both declined because they refused to see exclusively the demonized personality as representing the entire population of the Soviet Union. We went through this in the 70s with Richard Nixon in meetings with Brezhnev. Brezhnev actually suggested to him that we and the Soviets should jointly launch a nuclear strike on China's nuclear development facilities. And again, Nixon declined, said, no, I don't believe in that. Preemptive war is not a good idea. And effectively, what we've done now to Iran is preemptively attacked Iran on the assumption that this was going to prevent them from developing a nuclear weapon. In fact, the failure of these preemptive operations, I think, will lead to the point in time when the Iranians actually develop and field their own nuclear deterrent to prevent us and anybody else from at some point attacking them, for the same reasons that Pakistan and India also developed their weapons. So I don't think that logic holds up. Now, when you get down to the person, and I can't speak for the pilots because they're in a different sphere of activity from us, But if you're on the ground, the best way to stay alive in combat is to kill the enemy before he has a chance to kill you. And I said that repeatedly, and I meant it. When you understand that, you have to understand that there will be mistakes, that people will be killed that you probably didn't intend to kill. But when you've got thousands of soldiers and Marines who are trying to do what you asked them to do, and at the same time also avoid being unnecessarily killed, you're going to have those mistakes. But I don't think that means that everybody goes in with the intention of killing everything that shows up in front of them. That's not necessarily the case. But the longer the war lasts, the more blood that is spilled, the more fighting and killing that occurs, the more likely people involved in this are to take the position, let's just annihilate them and get this over with. Of course, that's always an illusion. No one can annihilate anybody. That was tried during World War II by multiple combatants and belligerents. But that kind of mentality takes over. And again, you have people that are called commissioned officers. Their job is to hold this in check, to contain these emotions. Because if the officer can't do that, then you're going to get the worst possible numbers of crimes. Not because the people that are fighting are bad. They know that the way to stay alive is to kill the enemy first. It's that simple.
It's just unfortunately, I totally get that at the tip of the spear. That's the only thing you can do. It would be irrational to do anything less than that. But man, on the backside, if some of your mates die in a war that should never have been fought, that's going to be a little harder to deal with.
I know that happens. That eventually happens. I mean, back in 1991, I was disappointed because I thought, if nothing else, we should send a force to Baghdad and demand the surrender of Saddam Hussein and anybody else with him. Put this place under a new set of generals, and then we can go home. But we didn't do that.
I do remember that, as a matter of fact. Well, let's take a look at where we are. This one, you have laid out basically how there is no military solution to this. We can't force the Strait of Hormuz open. Ground troops are going to do nothing but basically get a lot of Americans killed. That's not enough to put any pressure on the regime anyway. Well, one wonders if that is starting to get through to the president, because this is the Wall Street Journal reporting today that Trump tells the aides he's willing to end the war without reopening the Strait of Hormuz. It says in recent days, according to this article, Trump and his aides assessed that a mission to pry open Hormuz would push the conflict well beyond the timeline of his 4 to 6 weeks. He decided that the U.S. should achieve its main goals of hobbling Iran's navy and its missile stocks, hobbling, not destroying, and winding down current hostilities while pressuring Tehran diplomatically to resume the free flow of trade. Obviously, when I read that, I'm like, well, that's zero chance. And then they addressed that. If that fails, Washington would press allies in Europe and the Gulf to take the lead on reopening the straits. And it seems that this morning that is something he's doing, because these are two true sources he posted within 10 minutes. He said, first of all the countries that can't get jet fuel because of the Strait of Hormuz, like the United Kingdom, which refused to get involved in the decapitation of Iran, I have a suggestion for you. Number one, buy from the U.S. We have plenty. And number two, build up some delayed courage. Go to the Strait and just take it. You'll have to start learning how to fight for yourself. The USA won't be there to help you anymore, just like you weren't there for us. Iran has been essentially decimated. The hard part's done. Go get your oil. And then 10 minutes later, he turns to France. The country of France wouldn't let planes headed to Israel, loaded up with military supplies, fly over French territory. France has been very unhelpful with respect to the butcher of Iran, who has successfully has been eliminated. USA will remember. So what do you make of what this allegedly says about where President Trump's mind is right now? I mean, if he can't open the strait, if he can't defeat the government militarily, what other options does he have?
Well, keep in mind that Iran did not shut down the traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. Lloyd's of London did that. The underwriters who provide insurance for the vessels that travel in and out of the Persian Gulf, they would not underwrite any shipping because they're not going to put, themselves at risk of total bankruptcy in a war zone. So that needs to be understood. That's why the whole notion of mining the strait or putting in barriers and so forth. That was never necessary. The Iranians understood that. Now, as far as the free flow of trade is concerned, that's going to resume. In fact, some people would argue it's begun to resume. Unfortunately, not at the pre-war levels, although that eventually over many months can change. But the Iranians are simply saying, if you are U.S. or Israeli flagged ships, if you are in league with them, if you're supporting them, then we're not going to let you go through the strait. It's very simple. Everybody else is being pretty much told you can do it, but you have to buy your oil in yuan. Now, if he's going to go ahead and destroy the Iranian infrastructure for the oil system, if you will, the energy system, and the desalination plants, then I think that pretty much puts to bed any chance whatsoever for the Gulf to recover over many, many, many years. It's just not going to happen. So these are foolish observations or statements from someone who doesn't really understand what's going on. Secondly, the British and the French, I think, at some point are going to tell us to stuff it where the sun doesn't shine. Harold Macmillan, whom I regarded as a very good British prime minister, had the foresight and the wisdom to keep Britain out of Vietnam. We went to Harold Macmillan and said, we want you to join us in Vietnam. I said, forget it. That has nothing to do with NATO. NATO was always formed as a defensive alliance to defend and protect the people of Europe from communism. That's what it was about. We've been trying to instrumentalize the alliance as a set of vassal states who, on demand from Washington, provide troops for whatever we want them to do. I mean, this is sort of like the Roman Empire. It's ridiculous. It's the kind of thing Napoleon Bonaparte did to the countries that he controlled. And so he would have tens of thousands of Germans and Poles and others fighting for France. This is ridiculous. This is 21st century. That's not going to happen. They're not going to participate. They have no incentive to do so. And this sort of diplomacy by X is catastrophic. You end up offending people unnecessarily and you make yourself look ridiculous. And I think, these opening statements about the Strait of Hormuz demonstrate he doesn't really understand what he's dealing with.
But what do you think about the possibility? I mean, this would in one sense be pretty Trump-like to just say, I don't want to keep going with this. It's too costly to keep pursuing, a military solution here. So I'll basically just kind of walk away and just toss it off to the Europeans to try to figure out. I mean, do you think that's a possibility he could do? And what would that look like?
Well, I think it's a very strong possibility that we ultimately simply pack up and pull out. I mean, I keep telling people, what did we do after 8 years in Vietnam? We left. It took another 2 years after we left for the regime to completely fall apart under assault from the north. But the point is, we had no good ideas. We had no solutions. We squandered American blood and treasure stupidly. There was never an attainable objective. And as a result, we looked ridiculous. But it was, for various reasons, not taken as evidence for our weakness and stupidity. And of course, we did recover from it. Now, what we're doing at the moment is we're beginning to look feckless because we have thrown everything that we possibly can, short of a nuclear weapon, against the Iranians, and it hasn't worked. So if you're sitting anywhere in the world, whether it's Brazil or China or Russia or anywhere else, you're looking at this and saying, oh, this is interesting. Clearly, we can defend ourselves against this. It's not as bad as we thought. So I think we're beginning to look weak, which is what happened to the British after the Boer War. It's not a good thing for us at all. But again, I don't know that President Trump is thinking in those terms. If he's just watching videos that show explosions and things burning without understanding the larger strategic implications, I don't see anything good happening in the short run. But over the long run, if he goes ahead and does what I think he's going to do, we won't accomplish our objectives at all. It'll get worse, and we'll just leave.
That's, sir. I mean, especially if he recognizes that this is beyond military means, we can't win this, then one would hope he would come to that conclusion in action and not send anybody on the ground into a mission which would only cause casualties and then not die. I've unfortunately seen that play out even in Afghanistan. I saw, so I don't have a lot of hopes for that. But it's not only the guys on the ground. And I want to take a look at something that's not being given a lot of consideration here, but I know it's something that you pay attention to and what your thoughts are here. This graphic here is showing, because of these attacks like the Eid-3 the other day that got blown up in Prince Sultan Air Base and some of the other aircraft that we've already lost, we've had to move our troops way back. So right now you are having to fly American airplanes rather, on these bombing runs, some from continental United States, some from Europe, etc. And you can see here, this is the number of sorties and where they've come from RAF Fairford in the UK, from the United States, continental United States. That is putting a tremendous amount of wear and tear on our airframes and our air crews. And there's lots of evidence that says, for every 1 hour of flight time and in combat, especially, you have to have like 8 to 10 hours of maintenance time. And when you have to fly that much, what do you have any concerns about the stress that's putting on the air crews as well as the aircraft themselves?
Well, remember, during World War II, we and the RAF together lost 18,000 bombers trying to penetrate German air defenses. That's why you had such high casualties in the 8th Air Force. Lost 58,000 men killed, almost twice the number of Americans in uniform killed that were lost in the Marine Corps in the Pacific. Now, this is a different world today. We spend a lot more money on individual bombers, billions of dollars, and we can't afford to put these bombers at risk. So we've got to be careful where we position them and how we use them. And so I think there are constraints on our ability to fully exploit high altitude bombing. They're not profound yet, but they're headed in that direction. I think we have to understand something else. President Trump said this war is going to end whenever he wants it to end. And I think he's telling you by implication that when he decides it's enough, he's going to pull out and leave. And I think the consequences strategically will be extremely negative. We will be finished in the Middle East. I think we're finished there now, frankly. All of these Sykes-Picot states left over from the Versailles Treaty in 1919 are going to vanish. I think there are going to be internal revolutions in the Arab world to deal with these, well, let's put it this way, the Epstein class in the Arab world that rules them. And ultimately, I think we're going to go in, but it's going to be very tough for the reasons that you outlined. Naval forces, and for that matter, ground forces or air forces, all have had to move a great distance away from where they want to go. And sometimes I have to remind people, when we landed at Normandy, we landed several hundred miles from the German border. If we had tried to land on the German coast, the whole thing would have been destroyed instantly. And by the time we got there in June of 1944, 82% of the German armed forces were on the Eastern Front, and we weren't really facing a very significant opposing force. The Germans were able to put 2 planes in the air against 5,000 of our fighters. So we're in a different position here. This is an enemy that is winning the missile war. This is the enemy that has built missile dominance. And we've had a hell of a time with it, and I don't think we can change it. What we'll see. But my fear is it will go in again, do pretty much what we did the first time around, and simultaneously try to move Marines and airborne infantry, Rangers, special forces, infiltrate these forces into the region. And again, the problem I have with infiltrating, can it be done? Perhaps. But once they're in there and you want to get them out, how do you get them out? Once they're in there, how do you feed them? How do you clothe them? How do you get them water? All of these problems. So, you're presenting the right picture for everybody strategically, what a challenge this is. And I'm sure that President Trump is being told these things, but I think we're desperate. And I think our desperation will overwhelm our common sense, and we'll go ahead with it.
Well, we don't have a lot of good of not doing what you said there. But let me ask you a question. We talked to you a number of times before this war started. And we asked you a bunch of things about what we could have done. You said a lot of things about in the years past about what President Trump should have done when he first came into office about the Russia-Ukraine war, which obviously could have saved unbelievable amounts of resources for the United States had he done that, but he didn't. He didn't take your advice here, and he did start this war. What can he do now? If you were advising President Trump right now, with all the things that have happened, the war we've got, not the war we wanted, and the situation we've gotten ourselves into, and the fact that Iran now controls the Strait of Hormuz and there's nothing we can do militarily to stop it, what advice would you give the President Trump to do right now?
Two things. First of all, right up front, I would urge him to go back and look at something that Robert Work, a former Marine officer who eventually became the Deputy Secretary of Defense under Obama, said in 2010. And this was something he wrote. He said, the Navy Marine team will never contemplate literal maneuver, in other words, maneuver near the coast of any opponent, until an enemy's battle network capable of firing dense salvos of guided weapons, read missiles of all types and kinds and drones, is suppressed. Consequently, the initial phase of any joint theater entry operation will require achieving air, sea, undersea, and overall battle network superiority in the quote unquote amphibious objective area. Now, the question is, can we do that? That's what I can't answer. I don't think we can, but it may be that we have now found the magic sauce that will allow us to go back into Iran, systematically root out all the missile launchers and underground missile cities and so forth. I don't know. I think it's unlikely. So that's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is, it's time to admit that we don't have a military solution to the problem. And I would urge him to make that statement publicly and say that we would rather settle this, short of war in some setting and ask for countries that are willing to do so to mediate. Now, that's something he's not going to want to do, Dan. This is a man for whom everything is mortgaged to vanity. He and his persona are at the center of everything. This is now his great war. Now, we all know it's because of Israel, and he's trying to utterly destroy Iran on behalf of Israel. But the truth is he's now taken this on board. In other words, he's adopted the Israeli mentality, is not just Israeli talking points, the Israeli way of war. And that's unfortunate. But that would be the other thing that I would urge him to do, because if you understand what Robert Work meant in 2010, you recognize the enormous challenge that we confront today in the Persian Gulf, then he might step back and say, well, then we've got to find another way, and that way will not be with military power. But I don't think we're there yet. And of course, he doesn't seem to care in the least what the economic consequences are. I think his war is driving us into a very deep recession. And the rest of the world is going to face all sorts of problems. It might even be financial, economic depression accompanied by famine in many places because of the fertilizer problem. So that's the best I can do, Dan. I don't know what else to offer.
Well, there's not any good answers. We'll just start with that. Last question I got for you today, though, is to kind of zoom back to the 30,000 foot level. When you see all these reports in the last week, just in the last 1 week, about how the U.S. and Israel are both running out of interceptor missiles, PAC 3, the Arrow 2, Arrow 3 systems interceptors are running dangerously low. THAAD systems are interceptors running very low, extremely expensive. Tomahawk cruise missiles, depending on which report you look at, somewhere between 650 and 850 were used in the first 20 some odd days of this war. We don't know how many are continuing to be used, but the bottom line is our inventories of all of these critical weapon systems, interceptors at the PAC 3 level, the THAAD, and then offensive missiles with the standoff with JASSMs and also with Tomahawks are at really low numbers because of everything we've given to Ukraine, everything we've given to Israel since 2023, and now we're expending here. What does this do to our ability to defend our global requirements if, God forbid, we should have some unexpected conflict with either China in the South China Sea or Russia in Europe?
Well, I know that we've expended more than 1,000 JASSM missiles, that is Joint Air to Surface Standoff Missile, at a cost of $1.5 million apiece. Some people think it's going to take a year or more to replenish these stocks. I'm sure we've come up with some additional JASSMs, how many I don't know. But these standoff attack weapons are the weapons of choice, because then you don't have to fly into the enemy airspace and put yourself at risk of being shot down. I don't see any evidence that the Russians or the Chinese, or for that matter, anybody else wants to attack us. You have to remember, we started this war. Oh, I know, the Netanyahu talking points. This began a long time ago. Well, if you want to talk to the Iranians, they'll take you back to 53 and Mossadegh's removal from power and the installation of the Shah and his regime and all the terrible things that ensued from that. I don't think that holds up. We absolutely attacked this. We launched a preemptive war on the assumption that it would work, and it would work quickly. That's all failed. So you have a choice. You can double down or you can try to get out. I don't think he has seriously tried to get out, because I think the Israeli agenda is our agenda, and that agenda demands Iran's destruction. And if we go into the recession that I think is coming, and the rest of the world faces at least a bad recession, if not worse, we're going to be held accountable by the world for the terrible things that we've done that simply did not work.
Well, I certainly hope that you're right there. I mean, there's no reason why China would want to attack us, or certainly not Russia, either one. But I just fear that if we do get into a war unexpectedly, we're going to be in a real world of hurt. And the last part,
Dan, I would just argue right now that there will be no war with us unless we start it. That's what people need to understand. They've been fed this sort of Fox News diet of enemies everywhere. We have to have this enormous armed forces and be prepared to strike and bomb and attack everyone, everywhere, all the time. That's not true. Our biggest problems from a national security standpoint, they're south of the border. They come in the form of drug cartels, many of whom are extremely well armed now, as we have discussed before, with drones and cruise missiles and a lot of things that people don't realize. That's very dangerous. That's where our focus ought to be. But we're not focused there. We're focused elsewhere. But, the Chinese and this Taiwan thing, this is ridiculous. To try and fight China over Taiwan is sheer lunacy.
yes,
It would make the Persian Gulf look like an afternoon outing. Same thing for Russia. I mean, we have not put forces into Western Ukraine. God help us if we do. That would be fatally stupid. Again, nobody seems to understand something we've talked about before. We are not a continental land power anywhere but in the Western Hemisphere. So when things go badly for us, we sail away, we drive away, and we fly away. We don't live in the Eastern Hemisphere. But the people we're harming all live in the Eastern Hemisphere. That's the problem.
that is the problem. Well, let's hope that we follow that advice. And even if just because of constraints, we don't do any more stupid things. And maybe that will be a silver lining to all this. In any case, we really appreciate you giving us your good advice here. And man, people should go to MacGregorWarrior.substack.com for some great Substack work here. You do a lot of good work here, a lot of things that are very relevant to what's happening right now. People should go there to see more of Doug Macgregor. You don't have to wait for him on this show. Thanks, Doug, for coming on. We always appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it.